Karen strode down the neatly manicured sidewalk, her face contorted in a scowl. The grating sound of her stilettos echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac as she marched up to the doorstep of the Johnson residence, clutching a clipboard in her hand. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing a puzzled-looking Jason Johnson. "Can I help you, Karen?" "As a member of the Homeowners Association, I'm here to discuss a pressing issue," she declared, her tone dripping with self-importance. Jason braced himself, fully prepared for the onslaught of demands that was about to come. "Your driveway," Karen began, her eyes narrowing. "It's simply too small to accommodate all the guests we're expecting for the annual HOA meeting next week. I'm here to inform you that you'll need to allow us to use a portion of your driveway for additional parking." Jason blinked, taken aback by the sheer audacity of her request. "Excuse me, you want me to give up my driveway for your event?" "It's not a request, Jason," Karen snapped, her lips pursed in a tight line. "It's a requirement. As a member of this community, you're expected to comply with all HOA regulations." Jason's brow furrowed, and he crossed his arms over his chest. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I can't just hand over my driveway for your convenience. That's not how this works." Karen's eyes widened, and her grip on the clipboard tightened. "Do you have any idea how much this will inconvenience the other residents?" "Think of the community, Jason." "I am thinking of the community," Jason retorted, his voice rising. "And I'm thinking of my family, who rely on that driveway on a daily basis. I'm not going to just give it up because you demand it." Karen's face flushed with anger, and she took a step closer, her finger jabbing the air. "I'm warning you, Jason. If you don't comply, there will be consequences." Jason stood his ground, unwavering in his refusal. "I'm sorry, Karen, but the answer is no." With a huff of frustration, Karen turned on her heel and stormed off, her stilettos clicking angrily against the pavement. Jason watched her go, a sense of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. He knew that this was only the beginning of his battle with the formidable HOA Karen. As soon as Karen reached the safety of her own home, she slammed the door behind her and let out a frustrated scream. How dare Jason defy her, the all-powerful HOA president? This was an outrage, a complete disregard for the rules and regulations he had so carefully crafted. Pacing back and forth in her living room, Karen's mind raced, trying to devise a plan of action. She couldn't let Jason get away with this blatant act of defiance. The community's image was at stake, and she would not allow it to be tarnished. Suddenly, an idea struck her. Snatching up her phone, she dialed the number for the local police department, her fingers trembling with a mixture of anger and excitement. "Yes, hello, this is Karen Withers, the president of the Homeowners Association," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I'm calling to report a situation that requires immediate attention." The dispatcher on the other end of the line listened patiently as Karen described the events that had just unfolded, painting Jason as a stubborn and uncooperative homeowner who was jeopardizing the well-being of the entire community. "This is a clear violation of our HOA rules and regulations," Karen insisted, her tone growing more urgent. "I need you to send an officer over immediately to address this issue." The dispatcher, sensing the urgency in Karen's voice, promised to dispatch an officer to the Johnson residence as soon as possible. Karen's lips twisted into a triumphant smile as she ended the call, fully confident that her actions would bring Jason to heel. Little did she know, however, that her decision to involve the authorities would only serve to escalate the conflict, setting the stage for a confrontation that would have far-reaching consequences. The sound of a siren wailing in the distance caused Jason's stomach to drop. He knew that Karen's threats weren't empty, and he braced himself for the impending confrontation. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled up in front of the Johnson residence, and a uniformed officer stepped out, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson?" the officer called out, approaching the front door. Jason took a deep breath and opened the door, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Yes, officer. How can I help you?" "I've received a call from the HOA president, Karen Withers," the officer explained, his tone neutral. "She claims you're refusing to comply with an HOA directive regarding the use of your driveway for an upcoming event." Jason groaned inwardly, knowing that Karen had pulled out all the stops to get her way. "That's correct, officer," Karen came by earlier and demanded that I give up a portion of my driveway for the HOA meeting. I told her that I couldn't do that, and now she's called you." The officer nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "I see. Well, as you know, the HOA does have certain rules and regulations that residents are expected to follow. Have you tried to work out a compromise with Mrs. Withers?" "Compromise?" Jason scoffed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "She didn't come here to negotiate, officer. She came here to make demands, and when I refused, she decided to call the cops." The officer held up a hand, attempting to diffuse the tension. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson. However, as an HOA member, you do have certain obligations to the community. Perhaps we could see if there's a way to accommodate the HOA's request without causing undue hardship for you and your family." Jason opened his mouth to argue further, but before he could speak, the sound of Karen's shrill voice carried across the yard. "Officer, there you are," she exclaimed, striding toward the pair with a triumphant expression on her face. "Thank goodness you're here. As you can see, Mr. Johnson is being completely unreasonable and uncooperative." The officer turned to face Karen, his expression neutral. "Mrs. Withers, I've been speaking with Mr. Johnson, and he's expressed some valid concerns about the request to use his driveway. Perhaps we could explore some alternatives that would work for both parties." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she planted her hands on her hips. "There are no alternatives, officer. Mr. Johnson is required to comply with the HOA's directive. If he refuses, he'll be in violation of our rules and regulations." The tension in the air was palpable as the three stood in a standoff, each unwilling to back down. It was clear that this confrontation was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the standoff between Jason, Karen, and the police officer dragged on, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Turning to the source of the commotion, they saw a group of neighbors, drawn by the commotion, had gathered on the sidewalk. Karen's face lit up with a triumphant grin as she seized the opportunity to garner more support for her cause. "Neighbors," she called out, her voice carrying across the street, "I'm so glad you're all here. As the president of the HOA, I'm dealing with a serious issue that affects the entire community." The gathered residents, sensing the drama unfolding, quickly gathered around Karen, eager to learn more about the situation. Jason felt his stomach churn as he realized that Karen was about to put him on full display, using the community as leverage against him. "This homeowner," Karen declared, pointing an accusatory finger at Jason, "is refusing to comply with a perfectly reasonable HOA directive. He's putting his own selfish interests before the needs of the entire neighborhood." The residents murmured and nodded in agreement, their expression shifting from curiosity to disapproval as Karen continued her tirade. Jason felt his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, knowing that he was powerless to stop Karen's manipulation of the situation. "I've tried to reason with him, but he's being completely unreasonable," Karen went on, her voice dripping with false concern. "That's why I've had to call the authorities to intervene. Surely, as a community, we can all agree that he needs to do the right thing and cooperate." The residents erupted in a chorus of murmurs and nods, and Jason could feel their judgment weighing heavily upon him. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the officer raised a hand, silencing him. "Mrs. Withers, I understand your concerns, but I'm not sure this is the best way to handle the situation," the officer said, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Perhaps we could all take a step back and try to find a solution that works for everyone." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she folded her arms across her chest. "There is no solution, officer. Either Mr. Johnson complies or he faces the consequences." The standoff continued, with the gathered residents watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and concern. It was clear that this dispute was spiraling out of control, and the outcome was far from certain. As the tense standoff continued, the officer turned to Jason, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Johnson, I understand this is a difficult situation, but I would urge you to consider working with Mrs. Withers to find a compromise. Resorting to confrontation or defiance may only escalate the conflict further." Jason clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "Officer, I've already tried to reason with Karen, and she's made it clear that she won't accept anything less than complete compliance. I can't just hand over my driveway for her convenience, especially when it would inconvenience my family. The officer nodded, his brow furrowing. I see. Well, in that case, I'm afraid I'll have to side with the HOA on this matter. As an HOA member, you do have certain obligations to the community that you're expected to fulfill. Jason felt his heart sink as the officer's words sank in. He had hoped that the officer would be more impartial, but it seemed that even the authorities were siding with Karen and the HOA. Officer, you can't be serious. Jason protested, his voice tinged with desperation. You're telling me that I have to give up my own property for the convenience of the HOA. The officer held up a hand, his expression sympathetic. I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, but the law is clear on this matter. As an HOA member, you are required to abide by the association's rules and regulations. Failure to do so could result in fines, penalties, or even legal action. Karen's lips curled into a triumphant smile as she watched the exchange unfold. You see, Mr. Johnson, she said, her tone dripping with smugness. I told you there would be consequences if you didn't comply. Jason felt a surge of anger, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to let you and the HOA bully me into giving up my property. The officer sighed, his expression grave. I'm afraid I have no choice but to issue you a citation, Mr. Johnson, for failure to comply with an HOA directive. If you continue to refuse, we may have to take further action. Jason's eyes widened, and he shook his head in disbelief. This can't be happening. You're really going to side with Karen and the HOA over me? The officer nodded solemnly. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but the law is clear on this matter. You have until the end of the day to comply with the HOA's request, or face the consequences. With that, the officer turned and headed back to his patrol car, leaving Jason feeling defeated and powerless in the face of Karen's relentless determination. As the officer's cruiser disappeared down the street, Jason stood there, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, frustration, and a growing sense of resolve began to take hold as he realized that he couldn't simply roll over and accept Karen's outrageous demands. Turning to the gathered neighbors, Jason took a deep breath and spoke up, his voice carrying across the quiet cul-de-sac. Listen, everyone, I know Karen has painted me as the bad guy here, but I can assure you that's not the case. This isn't about my personal interests. It's about standing up for what's right and protecting my family's property. The residents shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Karen, sensing the shift in the mood, quickly interjected, her voice dripping with false concern. Oh, Jason, please don't try to turn this into some sort of personal crusade, she said, her lips curling into a patronizing smile. We're all part of this community, and we need to work together to maintain our shared values and standards. Jason felt his frustration boiling over as he watched Karen's effortless manipulation of the situation. Shared values, is that what you call using your position of power to bully and intimidate your neighbors? The residents murmured in response, some nodding in agreement, others still appearing unsure. Karen's face flushed with anger, and she took a step towards Jason, her finger jabbing the air. How dare you accuse me of bullying? I'm simply trying to uphold the rules and regulations that we all agreed to when we moved into this community. If you can't comply, then you're the one who's jeopardizing our shared vision. Jason shook his head, unwilling to back down. I'm not going to comply with something that's clearly unjust and unreasonable. This isn't about the rules, it's about you abusing your power for your own personal gain. The residents fell silent, their eyes darting between Jason and Karen as the tension in the air thickened. It was clear that the battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was willing to concede. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Jason knew that he was facing a pivotal moment. He could either give in to Karen's demands and surrender his driveway, or he could stand his ground and risk the consequences. The decision, he knew, would have far-reaching implications for both his family and the entire community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood, the standoff between Jason and Karen only intensified. The gathered residents watched with a mixture of fascination and unease, unsure of whose side they should take. Karen, emboldened by the officer's support, narrowed her eyes and took a step closer to Jason. This is your last chance, Jason. Either you comply with the HOA's directive, or you'll be facing serious consequences. Jason squared his shoulders, unwavering in his resolve. I'm not going to give in to your demands, Karen. This is my property, and I have the right to use it as I see fit. The residents murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Jason, while others cast wary glances in Karen's direction. You're being selfish and short-sighted, Jason. Karen spat, her voice rising in pitch. Don't you realize that your actions are going to have a negative impact on the entire community? I'm not the one being selfish here, Karen, Jason retorted, his own voice rising to match hers. You're the one who's trying to strong-arm me into giving up my property for your own convenience. The tension in the air was palpable, and the residents shifted uncomfortably, unsure about how to proceed. Some began to drift away, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond their control. Suddenly, the sound of car door slamming startled everyone, and they turned to see a group of uniformed officers approaching the scene. What's going on here? One of the officers demanded, his tone authoritative. Karen quickly stepped forward, her face flushed with triumph. Officer, this man is refusing to comply with a directive from the Homeowners Association. I need you to intervene and ensure that he follows the rules. The officer turned to Jason, his expression stern. Sir, is this true? Are you refusing to comply with an HOA directive? Jason felt his heart racing, but he refused to back down. Yes, officer, that's correct. Karen is demanding that I give up a portion of my driveway for the HOA's convenience, and I'm not going to do it. The officer's brow furrowed, and he looked from Jason to Karen and back again. I see. Well, this is a delicate situation, and I'm not sure there's an easy solution. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the officer held up a hand, silencing her. However, I can't simply take sides without a full understanding of the facts. I'm going to need to investigate this further before making any decisions. Jason felt a glimmer of hope, while Karen's face fell, her triumph quickly turning to frustration. The standoff continued, with the residents watching in rapt attention, unsure of how the drama would unfold. As the officers began to investigate the situation more closely, the tension in the air continued to build. Karen, her confidence shaken, hovered nearby, determined to sway the authorities in her favor. Jason, on the other hand, stood his ground, his resolve unwavering. He knew that he was in the right, and he was prepared to fight tooth and nail to protect his property and his family's interests. After what felt like an eternity, the lead officer approached the two combatants, his expression thoughtful. All right, we've had a chance to review the HOA's regulations and talk to some of the other residents. The officer began, his voice measured and calm. And it seems that while the HOA does have the authority to request the use of a resident's property for community events, there are certain stipulations that must be met. Karen's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to interject, but the officer raised a hand, silencing her. According to the HOA's own bylaws, any such request must be made with reasonable notice and accommodate the affected residents' needs. It also requires the HOA to provide compensation for the use of the property. Jason felt a surge of relief, while Karen's face contorted with indignation. But that's not what I told you, she protested, her voice shrill and desperate. The officer fixed her with a stern gaze. Well, Mrs. Withers, it would appear that you've been misrepresenting the HOA's policies to both Mr. Johnson and the authorities. That's a very serious offense. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, and she stumbled backwards, her composure crumbling. As for you, Mr. Johnson, the officer continued, turning to Jason, it seems that you were well within your rights to refuse the HOA's initial request. However, if they were to make a new request that complies with the regulations, you would be expected to cooperate. Jason nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I understand, officer, and I'm more than willing to work with the HOA, as long as they follow the proper procedures. The officer nodded, his own lips curling into a faint smile. Very good. Now, I suggest you both work out a mutually agreeable solution. And Mrs. Withers, I'd advise you to familiarize yourself with the HOA's bylaws a bit more thoroughly in the future. With that, the officers turned and headed back to their patrol cars, leaving a stunned and humiliated Karen in their wake. Jason watched as she stormed off, her stilettos clicking angrily against the pavement. He knew that this was far from the end of their conflict, but for now he had emerged victorious, his property and his principles intact. As the neighborhood settled back into its familiar quiet, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and relief. He had stood up to the HOA Karen, and he had won. It was a small victory, to be sure, but one that filled him with a renewed sense of hope and determination.